So what we're looking at today is the Saucony Peregrine 7. As the name states, this is the 7th iteration of this shoe. It clocks in at 9.4 ounces, and in women's is a 8.4. Both models share the same heel-to-toe drop, which is 4 millimeters with a stack height of 21.5 in the heel and 17.5 in the forefoot. So with that said, let's get up close and personal and see what's new and how these things are holding up. So let's start by walking through the upper. And one of the biggest differences in version 6 versus the 7 is that the 7 has an exoskeleton on it. So last year's model and all previous models of Peregrines had a lot more mesh and stitching that existed to kind of hold the upper together. This year we have these TPU overlays. You sort of see them throughout, these kind of crossing patterns that anchor to the laces. Basically cutting down on stitching, so when you feel the inside of the shoe you'll notice there's no stitching that's in there, so reducing hot spots. And also creates a more precise feel, I feel like, over other versions. And then the way they work through dissipating heat, because you do have plastic effectively running along the sides of the shoe, is all the way throughout. You'll see these little windowed mesh areas where there is not an exoskeleton. And then of course in the toe area where it's very much exposed, no TPU here. This is all just mesh. So a nice update on that front. Definitely gives it a more secure fit. When we roll around to the heel, one of the previous, I think, complaints from the last version was a really rigid heel cup. I know myself and other runners that I talked to experienced the same thing. So a couple things have been done here. One is they've lowered the height of how high up that heel cup sits. And then the second part, and you can see that by the flexibility here, it's not going up quite as high. And then the second part is it's just more padded. So it's still a rigid heel cup. It still has that good lock-in feel, but I didn't feel like you had to deal with some of the break-in and those sort of things that existed in the previous version. So definitely a welcome on that front, and something I noticed immediately the first time I put them on my feet. When we roll around to the laces here, previous versions had standard eyelets like what we have up here on the top two. These went to sort of this loop enclosure, and you'll also notice the removal of the gator hook that existed in previous models as well. So kind of all the way throughout there's been pretty decent changes that have existed all the way throughout this shoe as it relates to previous versions all the way up to the 6. When we look at the tongue here, effectively we are looking at from roughly the top 3 eyelets are not gusseted, and then everything below that is. So the tongue is connected with some spandex in here. It's going to be tough to see on camera, but basically to keep debris out from here down. Toe box wise, I feel like this is a wider toe box than what we had in previous versions. Don't feel like my pinky toe is quite as crammed up in these, so a little more foot splay allowed in this version. And I have what I would consider a mostly wide forefoot, so definitely a welcome addition there. And then more of this exoskeleton TPU mask. Now this is not a hard toe box like we see on some shoes that have really a lot of stuff built up here. You definitely have the sole that wraps around at the apex and gives you a good bumper, but it's really not something that I've noticed too awful bad, and that might just be because of the shape of the shoe. But in general, if you're somebody that stubs your toes a lot, especially on the outsides, not a ton of protection here, but I feel like it's definitely adequate. Alright, one of the other updates here that is interesting in my opinion is the addition of the EverRun sole. So if you look in there, it looks a lot like styrofoam. So Ultra has a compound similar to this, Adidas has a compound similar to this, and it's this, you know, lots of kind of various densities, little foams that are very bouncy feeling, and it is noticeable to me, especially when you're on harder surfaces. This shoe seems a lot more responsive than the previous version. It actually feels like a really good responsive trail shoe. And not that the previous version wasn't, but there's definitely a feel here, I think, of added bounce that wasn't there before. While I'm on it, on the insole, we can see the insole here is fairly standard. Pretty thin and tends to roll up when it's wet. Something I definitely would like to see updated. But you can always glue those down if that's a major problem. As we move our way over to the midsole here, we talked about the EverRun, kind of running the length of the shoe, and on the outside here, we've got a single compound mesh, really all the way around, and this is softish, I would say. So it's not a very dense foam, but it's also not a very soft foam. I would definitely say it's right in the middle in terms of squishiness. So you're going to have some ground feel, but you have enough cushion underneath you that it doesn't feel jarring. Roads and harder surfaces don't feel like they take a beating on you. This shoe feels just about right in terms of what the midsole offers. And then as we move our way down to the outsole, if you're familiar with the last version of the Peregrines, then this is going to look exactly the same. So we have the same rock plate that's sitting here in the forefoot that's exposed. You can kind of see that little carbon fibery looking holes here in between, and then what's called the Power Track outsole. This is, to me, a really great outsole. Pacific Northwest has been just a mess this year in terms of weather, and I've always had a ton of confidence wearing these in just about every condition, you know, except for the slickest of ice, and in those cases you're going to need something, you know, really specific like ice spikes or potentially maybe one of Saucony's ice blend specific outsole that they actually have on their winterized version of the Peregrine. But they have, these things are, I feel like, spot on. I always have a ton of confidence in these with uphill facing lugs, downhill facing lugs, your brakes, and just a really luggy, toothy outsole that definitely adds a ton of confidence. So with all that in mind, let's flip around and talk about final impressions. So to wrap it up, the 7th version of this shoe is definitely, in my opinion, the best to date. The upper, the new exoskeleton, is, I think, a much more secure fit. You've got a little more room in the toe box. The EverRun midsole feels a lot better than what we've dealt with in the past. They kept the same traction as last year. The downsides are going to be that I'm definitely seeing some wear and tear on these. So we've had a rough winter here in the Pacific Northwest. Lots of rain, lots of snow, lots of just sludge, and there's definitely some wear showing on these things after 150 miles. So a little bit of these pinch points here and possibly some of the shoe kind of delaminating from the upper. How far that's going to go, I can't say at this point, but overall, given what I've put these things through and the terrain that they've been in, I'd say they're probably on average with about everything else. And then the last thing I think that is probably the most problematic of every Peregrine that I've ever worn is the insole slides every time it gets wet. So obviously you could glue that down to help with that, but that is one thing I think plagues these shoes and I'd love to see an update on. So with that said, questions, comments, leave those below this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.